Trump just rejected Iran's latest peace proposal and called it unacceptable. But here's the part that makes this situation far more interesting than the headlines suggest. Iran probably never expected the U.S. to fully accept the deal in the first place, because this was never just about peace negotiations. It's about power, survival, and ultimately who gets to shape the future of the Middle East. For most Americans, the phrase Iran nuclear talks immediately brings up two things: nuclear weapons and sanctions. And on the surface, that makes sense. The U.S. sees Iran as a country expanding its regional influence while moving dangerously close to nuclear weapons capability. Iran, meanwhile, sees itself as a country boxed in by sanctions, military pressure, hostile neighbors, and decades of American containment strategy. And once both sides start believing they're acting defensively, real compromise becomes incredibly difficult. One thing that's often misunderstood in the U.S. is this: for Iran, the nuclear issue is not only about military power, it's also about survival psychology. Iran's leadership spent decades watching what happened to governments that gave up strategic leverage. Iraq was weakened and eventually invaded. Libya abandoned its nuclear ambitions, and years later the regime collapsed. Meanwhile, North Korea kept its nuclear deterrent and avoided regime change wars altogether. Now, whether Americans agree with that logic or not is almost beside the point, because inside Tehran, those examples shape the mindset of an entire generation of security officials. So when Washington says, completely dismantle your nuclear capabilities, Iran doesn't hear, let's reduce tensions. Iran hears, give up the thing that keeps you safe. And once a government connects strategic capability to national survival, major concessions become politically dangerous. But the U.S. has its own political reality too, especially under Trump. Because politically, Trump cannot afford to look like he accepted a weak deal with Iran, not after years of taking a hardline position. If Iran keeps enrichment capability, maintains regional influence, and still gets sanctions relief, many American voters, along with Israel and U.S. security hawks, would see that as Iran walking away with the better deal. And this is where the deadlock becomes almost inevitable, because now both sides are trapped by the same fear, looking weak. Iran worries compromise could weaken deterrence. Trump worries compromise could project weakness globally. And historically, once countries start treating compromise as humiliation, diplomacy becomes extremely fragile. But here's the bigger issue. This stopped being only about nuclear weapons years ago. The real struggle is about regional influence and long-term power. Over the last 2 decades, Iran built influence across the Middle East through alliances and armed groups in places like Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. From Tehran's perspective, these networks create strategic depth, a buffer zone designed to keep threats away from Iranian borders. But from the perspective of Israel and many U.S. allies in the Gulf, those same networks look like expanding Iranian dominance across the region. So even if the nuclear issue gets partially resolved, the deeper geopolitical rivalry still remains underneath everything. And that's why every negotiation eventually spills into Lebanon, oil shipping, the Strait of Hormuz, regional militias, and military positioning across the Gulf. At this point, the conflict is less about centrifuges and more about who gets to shape the balance of power in the Middle East itself. And honestly, trust between Washington and Tehran is almost non-existent now. Iran still remembers previous nuclear agreements collapsing after years of negotiations. Meanwhile, many American officials believe Iran uses diplomacy to buy time while strengthening itself regionally. So both sides enter negotiations assuming the other side has hidden intentions. That creates a very dangerous environment for diplomacy. Because once trust disappears, even small concessions start looking risky. And that's exactly why outside mediators suddenly matter so much. Countries like Oman and Qatar are quietly trying to keep communication alive behind the scenes. But China is becoming especially important here, because China depends heavily on stable Middle Eastern energy supplies. If tensions around the Strait of Hormuz escalate badly enough, global oil prices could spike very quickly. And that would hit economies everywhere. including the United States. So where does this go from here? Probably not toward total victory for either side. That's the reality. Iran is unlikely to completely give up strategic leverage. The US is unlikely to fully accept an unrestricted Iranian nuclear program. So the most realistic outcome is probably some form of managed compromise. Something gradual, maybe limited enrichment under strict international monitoring. Maybe phased sanctions relief, maybe unofficial understandings around regional escalation, not trust, just controlled tension. And interestingly, a lot of international diplomacy works exactly like that. Not because countries suddenly become allies, but because both sides decide the alternative is worse. And that may be the real story underneath all of this. This conflict is not fundamentally about uranium. It's about whether Iran remains an independent regional power with influence across the Middle East, or whether it eventually becomes constrained inside a US-led regional order. That's the real negotiation happening beneath the headlines. And maybe the most worrying part is this. Both sides still seem to believe time is working in their favor, which usually means neither side feels enough pressure to compromise yet. And historically, that's when situations like this become unpredictable. So the real question is, can the US and Iran realistically rebuild trust after decades of sanctions, proxy wars, and failed agreements? Or has the relationship reached a point where both sides now only understand pressure and deterrence? Because if this conflict continues escalating, it won't just affect Washington or Tehran. It could reshape oil markets, global security, and the balance of power across the Middle East for years to come. And honestly, this is one of those stories where the headlines only show maybe 10% of what's actually happening underneath. So if this breakdown helped make sense of the bigger picture, and you want more deep-dive geopolitical analysis without the usual cable news noise, make sure to like the video and subscribe. And definitely leave a comment below, because this is one of those issues where different perspectives really matter. Is the US being realistic with its demands? Or is Iran using negotiations mainly to buy time and preserve leverage? Curious to see where people stand on this.